because of that, I have been given opportunities and I have been given things that other people haven't, or that have held them down. And I think that's the big ask right now. People just
I think that's
recognize
great. I think that's great. And also to, to recognize, empathy is everything. To be able to, even for us as women, to be able to have some understanding of how even perpetrators might feel or what's going on in their heads. And that's why I'm coming back all the time to the psychological.
I think initially you're starting to spread awareness of that this is not a new problem, it's an old problem. And to me it's almost like saying you're setting up a system or a government or something, or it's almost like an insurance policy. Okay, I want to take out an insurance policy if I'm attacked or if I'm raped. That policy or that insurance company has a group of lawyers to defend me.
That's right.
And so now, here again, the system, okay? It may not be perfect, but it's a system.
I love your word insurance because I think the Me Too movement has given women some tiny modicum of insurance, because the guy who would maybe unthinkingly just grab some
Right.
is going to think twice now.
It have some repercussions.
Yeah. And this is the first time in history that that's been on our side. You think twice, buddy.
And on the other side, there's a sense of feeling that if I do come out, there will be people who believe me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
But
and
again,
we're not saying we believe you no matter what.
But that's
Right.
the power.
But we need
That's
that.
right.
If we don't have that people power, that we're fighting the system. If you've
That's
got the
right.
system on your side, then an insurance policy works for you. If you don't have the system on your side, you need masses of people behind you.
And I'll tell you, there's another thing in the favor of change here, which is there's a way it's become ludicrous. I mean, when it comes out what these men have done, the baddies, they're ridiculous. Opening your bathrobe to go. I mean, what is that? So there's a sense the shame is about, I don't want to be ridiculous. That it's really, I think it's so healthy, because it's throwing it back, it's throwing the behavior back at the person and saying, you need to look at this. This is ridiculous. And they've been living in a world where that guy has never been challenged. He can think that this is acceptable behavior.
Ridiculous to men, to reasonable men, and
Absolutely.
right, not just
To the whole world.
ridiculous.
I mean, they are shamed before their equals, the other men in their peer group.
And there was a not me movement too.
Oh.
So there was a hashtag Me Too, and then there was
Yeah.
a men's movement of not me, men coming out saying,
In favor,
I'm
yeah,
trying to raise my voice
yeah.
this way.
What happened to that one?
Yeah.
Well, it's a little bit weird, but yeah.
I'd like to hear more from
Well,
that.
I also too about the subtle female avoidance, accusation avoidance system that's going on now, where men of power are not hiring women so they can avoid the accusations.
You're raising a very important issue, and I haven't really thought about that at all.
The whole Mike
Yeah.
Pence,
Yeah. What
religious,
is
I can't be
your
sitting alone with a woman
right?
because God said so, or something like that.
What
just
is
to
your thought
avoid-
about how to address that?
I don't know. It's a discrimination of a sort.
It sure
But it's
is.
hard to prove
Yeah,
unless you
yeah.
get these. There was another
Mhm.
politician too who wouldn't have a one-on-one interview with a female journalist because
Oh,
Billy
man.
Graham for years would not be seen with a woman, so he
Yeah.
always had his coterie of people. And I don't know that I would think he was doing that in any devious way.
Well, that's part of their victimization.
Mhm.
They act like they're the victims. Oh, I have to be afraid. Now I'm not just afraid that something's going to happen to my daughter. Now I need to be afraid of the fact that my son's going to be falsely accused. And it goes into
Yeah.
their like, oh, I wouldn't do that. Men don't really do that, and we're going to be falsely accused. It goes into that whole psyche of we're the victims.
Yes, I go back to my central word here. This is messy, and it will have. I mean, there's just no way it's not going to have harmful repercussions for a lot of women. As I say, 40 of them on the front cover of New York Magazine, and how their lives have really taken a terrible dive. It's, power doesn't give up power easily. It's going to hang in and use everything it's got. And there's going to be backlash, big backlash from women.
Susan Faludi was right way back when. Susan Faludi in her book.
Oh, you
way
bet.
back when she predicted this. And
Yeah.
She was right.
Yeah. Okay.
I wish this could go on forever. As a professor myself, I love this. You guys are fantastic. And
This is-
applaud yourselves.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for participating and.
We have a little token of esteem.
Oh,
This
thank
is
you.
Suitable for framing, and also this book from
How
Larry.
wonderful.
Just for now.
Thank
You
you.
still have to promise me that you'll speak again and I'll give you some dates.
All right. How wonderful.
Okay, so
Thank
we're gonna
you.
pass the hat. We have no
Oh.
way of, thank you. We have no way of getting any kind of funding, so please, whatever you want to, we don't charge you to get in here, but don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Did you make this, Beverly?
Yes.
I saw handiwork, personal handiwork.
Did you get one of these?
Ready?
Oh, turn our phones off.
Take your seat.
Forgot.
Turn off your phones. Me too.
I thought you were reaching for your money.
It's a me too. No, it's where I keep my phone next to my heart. It is my pleasure. I have been waiting for this speech. I do the publicity for all these, so I know what's happening. In fact, we're almost all booked for next year, for 2020. But not you yet. We still want to get you back. But anyway, so I knew this was coming, and I really, really wanted to hear this speech. Dr. Joan Peters recently retired, and I can tell you she's going to be a lot more busy than she was when she was there. But she is a professor emerita. Now, most people think, oh, that just means retired. No, it's an honor. You actually have to earn this through the university. It's not automatic, and it's because of her record. It's because of her legacy, what she has done. And I don't remember the name of this, so I'm going to look at the notes. She did a lot of work during the second wave of the women's movement. And during that time, she created courses, some of the first courses in women's studies. And she also was a founding member, and I hope you're going to talk about this, Sagres?
Sagres.
Okay.
Double-edged sword of the Amazons.
Yeah, oh, I get it, okay. Which is a woman's think tank that has to do with politics. And of course, she's written a couple books. You have to do this when you're a professor. You have to publish, and you have to be a good teacher, and you have to also give back to the community. But I think this legacy that you've left here with these women's studies courses and in your books is going to be fantastic. So thank you so much for coming. And she's also a writing teacher, which is the most unsung hero of all professors, believe me. We had to do a lot of writing. And she has developed and taught with Dr. Frank Barajas, who's one of our favorite speakers here at the museum. So without further ado, please, Dr.
Thank you. Just before I begin, I want to point out that Frank Barajas and I taught a course in the cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s, which of course included the feminist revolution. And we did that for 12 years. And he is wearing his t-shirt, little illustration. So, and that was actually one of the most rewarding teaching experiences I've ever had, to teach with Frank and to really be talking about all of these issues with students who take for granted a lot of the changes that many of us fought really hard for. So I want to look at the Me Too movement in a very, I want to start off in a very personal way, because it's my feeling that you can't talk about what we're talking about here is sexual harassment and molestation. And it is certainly my experience, but I would like to check with you. I don't think, pardon?
Nothing.
Oh, just that the subject is the Me Too movement, which is of course about sexual harassment and molestation. I don't think that I have ever met a woman who hasn't had some experience of, I'm seeing this. Is there any woman here who has never been in any way violated by a man with attention that she did not want? That says volumes, even in this small room. And so where I want to begin is that this is very personal. When it happens to you, when there's a hand that reaches over to your body that you didn't invite, it is so personal. There is a moment of like almost an explosion where you can't see, hear, think. All you feel is invaded. And it's very personal. You can't even see beyond your personal boundaries at that point, which have just been violated. So I feel like we have to begin with the personal, and that anybody who gets up to talk about the Me Too movement or any aspect of sexual harassment really needs to begin with a personal story, because it's so personal. But where I want to take this is to an interpretation of what makes it so heavy is that it's laden with politics and economics, which you can easily miss when you're just talking about the personal part. In the personal experience of it, I think most women can relate, depending on how aggressive it is, that you kind of almost shatter. There's something that you go blind, deaf, and dumb for a minute, and you shatter. It actually affects your identity, which is what we'll be talking a little bit more about that, and your sense of self. And that's why it's so important to begin with the personal, because we have to look at what happens to us as women or as men when we're molested. So I want to begin with my own personal story. And it begins, actually, I'm going to begin with my mother, who was a model in the garment district. She was a showroom model, which meant that all of these factories back in the 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, were in the 30s in New York, the streets along the 30s. And the factories would be nearby or even attached to the cutting rooms where they would make the model dresses, and the showrooms where representatives from all over the country would come to buy clothing for their little stores wherever they were. And so the buyers would come in, and the women, the showroom models like my mom, would stand around in the back room with satin slips. And then you'd wait until the buyers came, and then the women would go and you'd put on the dress with the dots, and you'd put on the green lace, and then you'd come out and model for the buyers. But of course, the men ran these companies, these wholesale clothing companies. And the women, there would be like 10 women models and 1 or 2 bosses. And then in the back would be the cutters and the men of lesser status, the cutters, the sewers, and then the women who actually did the labor. And the bosses were the ones to worry about, because it's all about hierarchy and status. A lower status man is not going to take a chance with power. So my mother, who was not very maternal and never taught me much about anything, did mention when I got to be a teenager, she just wanted to say, you need to know how things are out there. And so she told me the story about it got so bad. She meant for me to know this, what it was that got so bad. She was never explicit, so I had to make it up in my imagination. That you know what happened, I was running around the cutting room table to get away from my boss. Running around I mean, this is like a comic, you know, it's ridiculous. And she was a teenager because she started to work when she was 14. And I never forgot that story, that's how bad it got, that she had to race around the cutting room table to get away from this guy who was charging after her. Well, what happened there? The models all knew. There were two choices. You either consented or you refused. If you refused, you risked losing your job, forfeiting your promotion, or failing. If you used the opportunity, if you thought of it as a female advantage, you accepted, this is the way it is. This is the way life is. Maybe you got to hold on to your job. Maybe you got a raise, maybe an occasional bottle of perfume, a role in the movie, a jackpot. The jackpot was the proposal. Maybe you would sleep with the guy and he would end up falling in love with you and proposing. So maybe you congratulated yourself on knowing how it was done. But a whole lot of women got nothing at all for doing what was wanted, for compliance. So if you talk enough, you know that the majority of women did not get any kind of advantage from complying. But I listened to my mother, and I thought, okay, this is what happens if you work in roles, in female roles. It seemed to me that being a model or a secretary or a nurse, the traditional female jobs made you too vulnerable. So I was going to avoid any of those. And I reasoned that if you worked alongside men as equals, it wouldn't happen. So I went to college and graduate school and became a professor because I really didn't know any other profession women could ever, and I never had a woman professor. I was, just kind of hoping that would work. So far, so good. Nothing ever happened to me in graduate school except for one thing. The chairman of comparative literature, which was the program I wanted to join, was David Vasiolek. He was a brilliant and very well-respected Russian scholar. So I went in with my application to join the comparative literature department, and I sat down. He was behind the desk. I was in front of the desk. Apparently his chair was on wheels, those, you're right. She even knows what's going to happen, right? I mean, these are comic book stories. He wheels around, bumps right up against my knees, and at this point, nothing has ever happened in my life like this. The only story I have is my mother's, and throws himself at me, grabs my chair so that I can't get away. Well, of course, I'd climb out of the chair and run the hell out of the office, and I was shaking and trembling. I didn't know what had happened, and I didn't know how I was going to sign up for the damn department because I was not going back in there. So the very next morning, as luck would have it, the student newspaper, this was the 60s, so there was a lot of students had their own courts of justice and their own newspapers. And the newspaper that was called The Daily Granite had a front page piece in which David Vasiolek's picture was right at the top, and there was a huge drawing of a jockstrap, and they were awarding him the Golden Jockstrap Award for male chauvinism, which is what it was called then. We didn't have the term sexual harassment. So I read this and understood that not only was I not alone, that this guy was a freak. That's what that said to me. So I once again could pull my own identity away from what happened and think of myself as a perfectly normal person, and this crazy guy who jumps all the women. We now know the shaming, the Me Too, the beginning of the Me Too movement. That was the first time I ever saw anything in print referring to what happens to women so commonly. And the fact that it was disapproving, all of this was new. It wouldn't have been disapproving in my mother's time, but in my time it was. And that helped me to, I decided this was an anomaly, push it over there, never think about it again. And it didn't happen until I got my first teaching job at Middlebury College. And Middlebury College. So I was 25 years old, meaning that I did not have a lot of life experience. This sort of thing really had not happened to me. I was one of the lucky ones. So Middlebury College at that time had no female professors, and they were about to lose their Title VII if they didn't hire women. In other words, they wouldn't be able to get federal money. So the year that I was hired, they hired 3 of us in different departments, and I was hired in English. And that meant, these are men who did not want a woman to teach at that college. They didn't want women colleagues. I didn't know this. And I was invading their territory as they saw it. So about a month after we started the semester and I had started to teach and everything was perfectly fine, the alpha male in the department, who was a famous poet at that point in time, named Bob Pack, he ran the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and he was a big deal. He was in the department. He was the department poet. He called me into his office. He had written me a note saying, "I'd love to get to know you." Well, again, we all know what follows. And again, I was 25, so I had no experience. I really didn't. I also had a wonderful brother. I mean, I just didn't think of men as predatory. And I went into his office. I sat. He invited me to sit on the what do you call it? The footstool or the ottoman in front of his chair. And I kind of was uncomfortable with that, but I didn't know why exactly. And I sat down on the ottoman, and he grabbed me and pulled me into his lap and began, pawing me and so on and so forth. At which point I managed to stumble out, feeling, I didn't even know how I made it to the door and having no idea what to do. And here's the moment when your identity is actually altered. I mean, I was a tough young woman. I did not easily fall, but I was shaking. I thought, what have I done wrong? I had mishandled something? Somehow it was my fault for the fact that it happened, for not knowing how to handle it, for not being suave and debonair and making him feel perfectly lovely and getting out with my own dignity intact. That it was all, it was me falling off the ottoman, crawling to the door. I mean, it was just a humiliating mess. So you're dumbstruck, and then you feel dumb for not seeing it coming, for being unable to handle it, and for coming undone. So, and you're totally by yourself. There is nobody I can talk to about it except my then husband, who was equally horrified. I mean, the kind of men I knew would have no idea how that could happen. And they didn't have any advice either. We were all in our own silences because this was such a taboo subject. You knew not to make waves, not to make it public. Very shortly after that, this was my first year teaching at Middlebury, a delegation of girl students came into my office, and because I was one of the only female teachers. Among that delegation, by the way, was the author Eve Ensler, who ended up writing the Vagina Monologues, which you may have heard of. And they told me that several of the men from the English department would come in a couple of times a week to the dorm where the English students were housed, and call room numbers and expect to be invited in to their room, and that they didn't know what to do about it, and they expected me to know what to do about it, and I didn't know what to do about it. As I say, I was 25 years old. Obviously I was already in the doghouse because I had refused this the alpha male of the department, what we did, we ended up creating a women's festival for the following fall, where we would discuss gender. We would discuss male and female roles. This was like 1971. This is what was happening. We had speakers. We had men come talking about sports and how sports perverts masculinity and, you know, female roles. And finally we had Gloria Steinem and Margaret Sloan, and they had 2,000 people came to the auditorium, to the gym. This is where they held it. And it was the largest crowd in Middlebury history ever. And all of the professors were there, and I thought for sure, now they understand. The speaking was great. People were cheering and giving them standing ovations. I thought, it's now okay. Everybody will understand. They won't behave that way anymore. And I was going down the tubes, I could tell, because all my other colleagues, Bob Pack had obviously told them I was now out, so they were very unpleasant to me. But I thought this was all going to change, but it didn't. The very next morning I get called into the chairman's office. I actually had just come back from the airport, taking Gloria Steinem and Margaret Sloan to the airport, come back, and my chairman says, congratulations on your big crowd, that was really good. And I'm sorry to tell you, but you're terminated. So, in quick succession, I went from the glory of feminist fantasy, it's all going to be fixed, to I lost my job. But I had to stay there for the rest of the year, and it was very interesting, actually. We ended up making, a Republican lawyer contacted me, and we ended up making a court case, because he said, we would have to, and I'm saying we because the woman before me was fired in very similar fashion, and the woman after me. They got rid of all three of us. And we made a case together. And he said, you'll lose this, but this is how you educate the courts. You have to take the issue to the courts. There is no language for sexism. And he was going to, as a lawyer, establish this pattern and so on. Okay, so that's the personal story. And I can only tell you that it's vivid in my mind still. Yes,
Make a comment, because
please.
my mother was one of the seamstresses who worked in the garment industry
Uh-huh,
in New York
yes,
in the 30s and 40s. So she was on the floor
yes,
on the sewing machine.
yes.
And she was telling me when I was older, that I guess I had shared a harassment experience with her, and she came, and I was curious about had she ever experienced it. And she said, oh yeah, there was one case where it was a family-owned garment industry. Father and a son were running, and the son was going around and physically molesting and harassing. And so the father would come out and admonish him in front of everybody. And that kind of like, okay, that's all you
Yeah,
get.
that's all there is.
That's all you get. And, but just the fact that the son felt he had carte blanche to
Absolutely,
go around and harass the women.
absolutely,
You know, I mean,
yes,
these weren't high-paying jobs, and these
Right.
women were trying to support their family.
yes.
And they have to put up with that nonsense.
Was it a sweatshop, would you say?
Yeah,
A sweatshop?
they didn't refer to them as sweatshops then. I mean, my
We
mother
work in
made-
the factory,
My
yeah.
mother made a good living in the 30s and 40s. And my other comment is, are you familiar with Susan Brown Miller's
Of course,
Men, Women, and Rape? I
Sure.
read that when it first came out. It
Sure.
changed my whole perspective
yeah.
of that. I mean, I would
Yeah.
recommend it to anybody.
And I mean, just the idea that every woman on every one of those sewing machines knew her vulnerability.
Yeah,
And they could not, it was never a union matter. It was never, you know what I mean? At that time, it was just what women had to put up with.
I think there was a general consensus. Nobody knew what to do.
Right,
I was
Right.
actually physically attacked in front of my boyfriend by my boss, by our boss. And he was just dumbfounded. He didn't know to intercede.
Right.
He didn't know to have words
Right.
with it. Didn't know what to do.
Right, right. And I'm actually going just next to talk about what's happening with men in these moments, in these roles. Because in a certain crazy way, it's all scripted. Anyway, that's where I want to go and try and tease out in these very personal experiences, which I'm sure are as vivid to you now as they were the day after it happened. To tease out what it is that's really happening there, because it's so laden with complicated vectors of experience and cultural, of culture. So, what I want to point out is that the guy who attacked me and the guy who attacked you were bosses,
Yes.
both of them.
Yes.
These are alpha males we're talking about. Not that they're the only people who molest and attack women, but they actually give us an opportunity to think about something that's very interesting. Look at the list. Bob Pack, by the way, was a very handsome guy. He was very attractive to women.
Is he dead?
Yeah, he's probably dead. I hope he's dead. But think about the names of the men who are being Me Too'd. Ben Affleck, Jeffrey Rush, Gerard Depardieu, Bill Cosby, Sylvester Stallone, James Franco, for God's sakes. These are fabulous looking guys. It's not like they could lack for sex. They could have all the sex they wanted. There's no doubt about it in my mind. And remember Kissinger, Secretary of State Kissinger, who was a troll of a guy. He was not a handsome dude like these stars, said, what's the most powerful aphrodisiac there is? Power. So the other men who are being Me Too'd, like Eric Bauman, the former chairman of the DNC, Corey Lewandowski, Trump's campaign manager, Sean Hannity, Tom Brokaw, Bill O'Reilly, Brett Kavanaugh, Peter Martins, Mario Batali, Placido Domingo, Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer. Think about it. These are men who could get all the sex they want. Why are they foisting themselves on people? What does that mean? What is that about? It's about, I would like to propose, it's not about sex at all. It's about power. About keeping women in their place, domination, the assertion of patriarchy. They have to test out what kind of woman you are. Compliant, accepting of patriarchy, or the dangerous kind, the rejecter, the contester, the one who wants to change things. Why, after all, would anybody want to have sex with someone who didn't want to have sex with them? Why would you choose that? Most normal people would feel the rejection, even the repulsion, reflected back at them. Ooh, how horrible. We don't want to feel unattractive. Yeah.
I think it also became institutionalized, particularly in education.
Yes.
And it still is
Say
today.
more.
And institutionalized in the media, in movies. So it's much more than the power thing. It's also a part of the way it is. I mean, the casting couch has always
That's right. But you bring up movies. Movies can make it look very attractive. It can make those men seem like real men. You know, I mean, movies can be very manipulating in that way. So I think sexual domination, I think you're getting at this, is how many men are taught to express their manhood. to override feelings, and this is my big point, to override feelings of insecurity, to participate in the holding up the patriarchy, to which their manhood requires allegiance. If you're going to define yourself in ways that this culture defines men, you have to push away any feeling of weakness, tenderness, all of the things that patriarchy requires that men are not. So, of course, most men reject the destructive and detestable cultural norms or find them as abhorrent and alien as most women do. Like your boyfriend standing there going, what the hell is going on here? You know, he didn't participate in that. He couldn't get even how somebody could do that. My husband, my colleagues, my male friends wonder along with me, what's wrong with these men? Who are they? What are they doing? Well, I think that they're men who are warped by patriarchy. Very often, they're the very men who are driven to power and achievement, who have had to disown their own vulnerabilities, their soft, tender selves, the confused parts of themselves, the troubled parts, parts we as human beings all have, whether you're male or female. If you, as an alpha male, need conviction, strength, and constant proof of your effectiveness, if you have to have the 100% alpha belief in your own rightness, talent, deservingness, then you have to override your internal doubts, your own internal turmoil. Those demons will take you down from that pedestal that you're on. So I offer the psychological interpretation that every time a man molests a woman, he is dominating the part of himself that identifies with that woman, with the weak, with the victim, with her. And two, he's acting out the basic alpha guarantee. You can have any female of your choice, the ultimate proof of your top dog status. So you're the boss in your mother's factory, his son got that message. I can have any of them. Even with a father saying, don't do that. The cultural message is so strong. Does anybody want to comment on that?
I
Yeah.
was thinking it's written into certain religious beliefs as well, that your heaven is
That's
having
right.
women.
That's right. I hadn't even made that connection. But that is, that you get to have them if you have been the right kind of male, right?
Well, what about during that time period, you have the free love and all this
That's right.
stuff? So wasn't that kind of a conflicting,
part-
a mood, it was a cultural change that was going on in the country at that time?
Absolutely. And that's why I actually wanted to start with my mother's cutting room table story, because that was before the sexual revolution. So it was happening, it was all over the place there. But once you had the sexual revolution, that's why I gave you the list of all the men who've been Me Too'd, because with the sexual revolution, women, Bill Cosby, who wouldn't want to sleep with Bill Cosby? And women were no longer restricted. You had birth control, you had, it was cool, right?
Pre-AIDS.
Huh?
Pre-AIDS.
Pre-AIDS, exactly. So there was, there was sex was happening everywhere. You didn't have to rape anybody. And that's part of my point, that it's so, you've got the conditions for mutual sex, and yet the rape is still happening, because it's something else.
Well, just can we set aside for a second the men of actual achievement and talk
Yes,
about
sure.
talk about the men of no particular
Yes.
achievement who behave in the same way. So can we just take this isolated example of the Greek farmer who raped and murdered that American scientist in Crete?
This was a recent,
For those of you who don't know, I've been obsessed with this case. This extraordinary scientist, American scientist, 60 years old, named Suzanne Eaton. She was a black belt in karate, an accomplished scientist, cook, musician. There wasn't anything this woman couldn't do. Happily married, 2 children, was in a conference, speaking at a conference in Crete, this wonderful vacation destination. She was also she was an extraordinary athlete. She was out jogging in the middle of the day, and suddenly disappeared. And they searched for a week for her body, found her body, raped and murdered in a underground bunker that had been created by the Nazis in Crete in the 40s. Quite quickly, they arrested her killer. He was a married man in his 30s, 2 children. His father was an Orthodox priest. He came from a very close-knit community, a nice family, and he confessed the crime. He said he went out that morning and he wanted to have sex, and no matter what woman he found, he was going to run over her with his car and immobilize her and rape her, and it led to murder. So that he wanted to have her, and he took her. And there was nothing. He was a little creepy in his background, but he had this. He came from a religious family, a deeply knit community. This sort of thing doesn't happen in Crete. It's not like the south side of Chicago. I mean, this is like, okay, he's admitted he was going to take any woman that crossed his path. He immobilized her with his car, brought her to this bunker, raped her while she was still alive, fighting for her life, and left her there to die. And then confessed the crime. Okay, so, he was going to take. So where does this come from?
So I didn't want to.
In your model.
Well, I hadn't finished with my model, but I didn't want to imply that it's only the alpha males, but I wanted to start with them because I find it so startling that these men who women throw themselves at, they're movie stars, are still behaving in that way. So I didn't mean to imply.
It's just that it's so much bigger than that, and that's what.
Oh, I was just taking that quadrant.
If I want to hear about all that, I just.
Well, I mean, I have no more to say about that. It just seems to me proof of the pudding that it's about something else, and
how is it about power and economics in this case, for example?
Well, I'm not going to isolate one case, but in the case where you're dealing with seemingly ordinary men who are not necessarily, they're not they're not CEOs, they're not movie stars, maybe they can't have the kind of sexual access they would like. But the line that's most important to me in what I said is that this is our culture gives men certain kinds of outlets for all their unresolved problems.
So that's
the model.
an answer to the question that I just asked you.
Well, that's what I'm giving you.
It's an international culture.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But it's it's patriarchal culture. So patriarchal offers what it offers to women who have all kinds of unresolved and anguished and neurotic problems is a very different pattern of outlets. What's offered to men is this conquer the side of you that feels in any way deprived or frightened or freaked out, or reinforce the part of you that fits a certain kind of male script. That's what I would say. Somebody had a hand up.
Oh, I
Yeah.
I would just, I'm all for taking it a step further. Instead of saying patriarchal culture, this is a rape culture.
Yeah.
We live in a rape culture.
Yeah.
There's a definition for it. We fit the mold. So do so many other cultures. There are some that don't, and they don't have this kind of problem.
Well, and you raise an incredibly important point. Also, we talk about rape cultures, where you look at countries where the armies overrun, and what they do is rape all the women as a way of showing they're the conquerors. Where rape is a currency. It's a valid expression of power.
Going back to Troy,
Sure.
that is the first time that it was documented that rape was used as a tool of war.
Well, that's fair. Yeah, yeah. And I think that's, it's sort of, for me, it underscores the point, that you have to raise men to believe that's the right thing to do. You have to raise men to believe that that is a valid outlet for, obviously, for strong emotion.
So I want to speak for the men.
Yeah.
I'm getting in dangerous spot.
No.
As a young boy, I think all of us could tell stories of a creepy male teacher that creeped in on my space. And I can tell you where I went to school, there was this teacher that everybody, all the boys, were like creeped out, and he would get close and touchy and do weird things, and so it. No,
I'm so glad you raised that point. I mean, I can remember, as I said, in college, nothing bad ever happened to me, but my boyfriend had that experience, with the creepy male professor, who of course was an eminent professor. What could he say? Just encroached.
And then later on in life, I was director of risk management for a high school district, and believe me, you would be amazed at how many cases alleged, proven, sometimes, a kid just trying to get back at a teacher, but most of the time,
it's real.
It was real, and it's just, it's pervasive.
And you're raising another point, which I was going to get to later, but I think it fits here. Men who are not supportive of this cultural hegemony are also hurt. So it's so like if you see another man in a work situation or in the high school, if you don't keep your mouth shut. I mean, this is what happened in the priesthood. This is what happens everywhere. You have, as a male, have violated the male rules, and so you're going to suffer. So, and there are so many stories. I mean, recently it came out how Mia Farrow's son, Ronan Farrow, you know about that story. He, who is a journalist, helped to suppress the Harvey Weinstein story.
No, he brought it out.
He what?
He brought it out.
He brought it out. Okay. The other guy.
Yeah.
Okay, that it was being suppressed. Thank you. A friend of mine just emailed me this morning. I didn't know about it. But in just researching this, there are 1,000 stories like that, where any man who speaks up is going to be, you're relegated to the female victim. You're now going to be hurt too, because you have to support men who behave this way. That's part of the cultural trap.
There was a case 20 years ago, maybe, involving a highly successful football coach who everybody knew, and it went on for years.
Right.
And then it finally blew up.
I mean, if you think about it.
A high school football coach.
But if you think about it, what's extraordinary is the other men who knew and who would not themselves behave that way, but who couldn't go near it. That's how powerful this imperative is. That's how much you are risking, if as a man, to step against this definition of manhood, even if you don't participate, or even if you're horrified. So yeah.
At the same time, we have this, culture in, let's say, the West, where, you treat a lady with dignity.
Little lady?
You open the door for her, you tip your hat for her.
Chivalry.
Okay, chivalry. How about Donald Trump, the joggers, raped in Central Park?
Yeah.
Full page ad, this rapist needs to be put down. So, of course, is this a cover-up for their own crimes? And in his case, of course, it was, because he's raped many women.
Right.
But what about the chivalrous cowboy, or chivalry in general? How about the chivalry in general, Europe and its roots? How does this figure?
Well, I mean, can't they coexist? Isn't that? I mean, it's so. Remember, it's like what I'm talking about psychologically going on in a man who does this kind of molesting is disassociative. The part of you that's raping this woman is one part that's disconnected from the part that's going to hold the door for you and, give you my arm and be
So
protected.
they're in the same man.
They're in the same, exactly.
Same man.
It's got to be disassociative,
Yeah.
or you wouldn't be able to live with yourself. Who are these priests who are, praying to God and then raping the boys? How do you do that in one psyche? They often coexist. Or you're the head of a megachurch and you denounce homosexuality and you're in the bathroom with the boys. So it's disconnection. Did you?
Oh, I was just going to mention, sometimes they don't look at women as people.
Absolutely.
It's like you're a commodity.
Absolutely.
I had a boss at Casablanca Records and Filmworks in the 80s who, here Donna, I was an accountant, called me in his office, here's $200, go buy yourself a pretty dress because I want you to take my client out to dinner, go out to dinner with my client tonight.
Yeah.
Like be his little prostitute.
Yeah.
And that happened so often, I had to just quit. And then I'm out of a job and I didn't do anything.
Absolutely.
It
Absolutely.
was horrible.
But not to be over dramatic, but remember, in the Nazi camps, Jews were not called people. I mean, you have to disassociate from the person in some way. That woman, the jogger in the Greek, she was a woman he was going to have sex with, but she was not. The empathy, there is no human empathy. You've got to disconnect it in order to do violence to another being. And you even see that in stories of like these child soldiers that have to kill people and don't want to. What they have to do to remove themselves from any sense of connection.
Would it be fair to say that your lecture today excludes mentally ill, psychopaths, sociopaths, serial rapists, that type of man? Are we talking about the general man?
Yeah, we're talking about general. We're talking about in the culture.
Certified sickies.
Oh, right. Although it's a continuum. In other words, people's mental illness is often expressed in certain cultural forms, if you see what I mean. I mean, a mentally ill person on a Tahitian island, part of that community, is going to express mental illness differently from someone who, let's say, grew up in Chicago. Because it's the language you learn that how do you express yourself.
But when you hear the latest stuff that's come out about Matt Lauer, where he fucked this woman until she passed out, that's psychopathic behavior. It's Matt Lauer.
It's a continuum.
I think it's a continuum.
Yeah, definitely.
And in fact, it's small. The allowance of this thing in childhood, from babyhood, then can lead to psychopathic behavior. I don't believe in illness when it comes to psychopaths. I really don't. I think that it's, again, there might be like a bad gene here or there, but culture really makes it.
Well, and think about, I guess it was Charlie Rose, who would come out to his crew and all the women and everybody in a bathrobe and expose himself. Are you crazy? Yeah, you're kind of crazy. That's what I mean. It's a continuum because it makes no sense. What is this man doing? He's a dignified TV interviewer.
It's really weird. I just did this yesterday. I listened to Matthias Reyes, who was the guy who raped the Central Park jogger who confessed the crime.
Okay.
It's very interesting to listen. It's on YouTube, to his confession, because he found Jesus, right? And he confessed the crime. He talked about exactly how he spotted her. She was jogging. She turned left. Exactly what he did. The crunches of the bones, the blood, in a kind of empathic way, And if you actually see him, talking with in other YouTube videos, back in the days when he confessed, he seemed like a pretty normal guy. I mean, he's a criminal for sure. But this is an example of a.
It's not so far. It's not so far.
I mean, he's incredibly well spoken and good looking, and like, you can't believe this guy did this thing. It's not so far.
Well, but, you know, I mean, I don't want to go into this area because it gets so complicated with what is madness, but when I was living in New York, there was a very famous serial murderer, Son of Sam. We were all afraid of Son of Sam. And you know, the last victim he picked off, they said, how did you choose that person? He said, well, I found a parking space. You know, parking space is a big deal in New York City. You get a good parking space, that's definitely who you're going to kill. You know, I mean, the disconnection, the level of human disconnection is so enormous.
I think to speak to the point of the continuum is there's plenty of examples of ordinary sexual harassment of people that we consider very
Absolutely,
normal.
absolutely.
So I have someone in my immediate family who came up from her anesthesia at the dentist office with her blouse undone.
Yeah.
You know, it's the
everydayness
it's the
of
date
it.
rape. It's the people that we consider our neighbors and our sons and our brothers that do things that they don't understand why necessarily, or the impact that they're having
That's
on
right.
the victim. So yeah, we could take it to one extreme, we could take it to another extreme, but there is a continuum, and where do you define the madness?
That's right.
You know, it's like any other quote perversion.
That's right.
Where, you know, to some people this is normal, to other people it isn't.
Right.
And that line could be anywhere along that line.
Well, also you take that behavior, let's say this ordinary dentist who, you know, has a feel on the side or whatever. If that's somebody who's bipolar and they're having a mood swing that's way off the charts, they're going to take that same behavior much farther. Do you see what I mean? So in other words, it's what our focus needs to be is the behavior, whether it's extreme or not. That's like where you are on the continuum. You could have a mental health problem, but it's still going to express in that way, because that's what we have. Did you want to say something?
I did. So mental health aside, but I wanted to add to something you said, is that the men who commit these crimes genuinely don't know how it affects the victim because we never say anything. And we don't bring that to light. The Me Too movement is so important in that way because it's finally shedding light and giving room for all of us to say, guess
That's
what?
right.
This happened to me. This is what it did to my life.
That's right.
It derailed my career. You weren't allowed to work it, or you dropped out of the department that you wanted to work in.
No, I was fired.
College, and then fired. I mean, this is a lot of talent that just goes away.
That's right.
And then lives are destroyed, and nobody understands because we don't talk about it because it's so taboo, and you just shouldn't rock
That's
the
right.
boat. And that guy's really powerful, and he needs to keep his money because he gives a lot of people jobs.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
I mean,
yes. And that's actually where I'm going next, which is the economics behind all of this and how it's connected to this larger issue. Yes.
I just want to say I worked in the film industry for about 40 years, and you're right. Exactly. That's what happens.
Well, and I
you don't
think
want to hurt other people.
That's it.
We
You want
don't.
to keep your job, you're getting a lot of money, you're getting a lot of attention.
that's
Anything
right.
you want, you can get, and that seems to be where they want to stay.
Well, and I actually would like to talk a little bit about that.
And it's
So-
today too. It's not. This isn't all 40s and 50s
No.
and 60s.
Oh, no. It's every day of our lives,
Right.
everywhere you go. So in order to open this up, I'd like to go back to my mother running around the cutting room table. My mother was a rejecter. She ran around the cutting room table and then ran out the door. She wasn't having it, which meant that she could not support her 2 children as a widow. Simply, the salaries for showroom models weren't enough, even if she could keep her job. And the pink ghetto, which is women's work, the work that, it's called pink ghetto when many more women than men work in that particular field, and mostly only women. To support herself and us, my mother's options were welfare, which wasn't an option for her. That was, in her culture, that was too shameful. Or marriage. And this was not about love. This is survival. And here's where we find the implicit connection between sexual abuse, molestation, domination, and economic powerlessness. It doesn't happen if you're not economically powerless. This is where we have to make the connection with what appears to be personal, as sexual connection does, and its relationship to economic connection. And this is true whether the sexual connection is mutual or predatory. So, we are economically interdependent. However, that interdependence can be fundamentally abusive, and that's when there are whole swaths of a culture, African Americans, women, Hispanic Americans, who simply don't have the access to prosperity that that white males do, that another group does. So that's an abusive, exploitative, unfair. You may have these whole groups that can't function equally. The interdependence can also be predatory. That's economic rape. You know, we talk about Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, or Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, or Suharto of Indonesia. They simply steal. They rape their countries. They steal the money, put it in their own banks, and get the hell out of there. Or they're president for life. It can be mutual as well, where you have a more or less egalitarian culture, as they do in some of the Nordic countries. But let's go back to the groping, the quid pro quo, which is the way to a job for a woman is to spread your legs. That rape, the drug put in her drink, those hands up her skirt or tongue down her throat. Strange as it is, I believe all of them are expressions of our institutional policies and politics. They're not separate. Our private and public lives are inextricably linked. Every gesture of personal domination is an extension of the attitudes that keep women from political power and economic power, as in, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren. She's not likable, not electable, too emotional, not really skilled or talented or smart enough. She's a ball buster. Those are the policies that keep women from power, and they are extensions of the disidentification with women. They're extensions of the same mechanism that allows men to look at women as objects rather than, as you said. Maybe it's you can't also, another approach to this, the family is her responsibility, subsidized daycare would threaten family values, 6 months maternity leave would threaten family values. So the result of these policies, which are, in my estimation, the very same impulses that move that dentist to open the girl's blouse, very same thing. The result of both of these, both sides, the personal and the political, is that women still earn 79 cents for every male dollar. Even today, this is today's stats. They're half the country's workforce, but less than a quarter of them are top 10% earners. Only 20% of women are in Congress, only a quarter of women are state legislatures, and we're most of the voting body. Only 9 female governors, only 6.6% of Fortune 500's companies, CEOs are women. Very few, 20% board members. A third of the employees of New York City security industry are women, and I assure you they don't have the top jobs. 10 million women a year are victims of domestic violence in the US. Okay, back to my mother running around the cutting room table. We'd like to believe that was post-war America, that women could only take jobs listed in the women's column of the papers. At that time, you couldn't cross over. Mad men ran the place. Now everything's fine. A woman could be a doctor, she can run for president, do whatever she wants. But even women who seem to be able to call the shots, like these actresses who came out, who started the Me Too movement, whoever they are, whether they're young professors, women in medical school, gymnasts, ballerinas, engineers, physicists. There was a huge expose of women, what was happening to women in physics. And the vast majority of women, remember, are still in the pink, not 40% of women are still working pink-collar jobs. Keeping in mind that the poverty line for earning is $25,500 a year, $25,500 a year at the poverty level. A woman receptionist, any receptionist gets $2,300 to $3,400 a year. A secretary makes $25,000 to $37,000 a year. Medical assistant, $31,000. This is what most women are working. A salesperson, way up there at $43,000 a year. A waitress, remember, many of these women are supporting children. Waitress, $21,000. Home health aide, $20,000 to $32,000 a year. A maid, $22,000 to $27,000 a year. The exceptions are unionized.
The maid is a really interesting one because if you're a janitor, which tends to be male, janitors make more than maids. Essentially the same work, different pay.
Absolutely.
Or a male nurse versus a female nurse. Or, where you look at the same job, but one has a male connotation and one has a female connotation. You see a difference in pay structure.
Yeah, and they're different titles slightly. I'm so glad you brought that up. And, RNs, social workers, and teachers are from 48 to 68. I mean, that's and only because they're unionized and they're government workers. Yeah, so.
But look at the pathways to leadership. Look at the pathways to leadership, though. So I was a principal of a large comprehensive high school in this county, one of only 3 in the whole county of females. So there, out of however many high schools in the county, it took me a long time to get to that position.
Right. The pipeline doesn't allow you through.
And that's a unionized.
You're right. No, yeah, I wasn't.
Pay scale public system where it was supposed to be equal.
A meritocracy.
There are structures within that make it otherwise.
Right. And we know that there's tremendous hidden prejudice where people aren't even aware that they are disqualifying you because you're a female. But when they do the absolutely neutral testing, resumes with female names versus male names, it all comes out, the patterns of rejection. So
I have to laugh when you said Millbury College, because the guy that was the chair of the department that hired me said, on the day I was hired, to the rest of the faculty, here's Beverly Kelly. He said the dean told me I had to hire a woman. Here she is.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, there was no shame. There was no shame. As I mentioned, they fired 3 women the year before me, and then the year after me. The woman they had fired before me, I didn't know this, they fired her because she was pregnant. She was married, she was pregnant, like that. They said, you should teach in a junior college if you're going to be a mother. I mean, they were able to say all of these things back then. They didn't need to cover it up. So what I want to say is the upshot is that women still marry for money, still stay in abusive marriages. They're too afraid of male violence to walk alone at night. And an awful lot of women are compliant. They throw in their lot with molesting males, alpha or not. They defend them rather than calling for some investigation. Note that 100 women at NBC signed a letter defending Tom Brokaw, including Rachel Maddow, before any evidence was in, which really upset the woman who came forward initially. After the Trump tape about pussy grabbing came out, Sarah Palin, speaking for millions of women apparently, said, "We like men like that." Well, sure. If those are the men you've known in your life, if that's what your father was like perhaps, if that seems like the way it is and your only means to prosperity and power, then sure. These women identify with male power and disidentify with their own lack of it.
I don't understand. I
Well,
just don't understand.
Yeah, and I understand why you don't understand, believe me. But it's that's why I have to center this in the psychology. It's that this is the reason why it's messy. We've made mistakes. It's not it's not always fair, but this Me Too movement is the only way this part of what is truly an equation, a continuum, is going to change things. If we don't address the madness of what goes on in every woman's life, behind some closed door, sometimes in the dentist chair, wherever it is, it's not going to release men as well as women to reflect on this crazy script that we're locked into. And only breaking the silence is going to change it. So, yeah.
Well, we saw with the civil rights movement that
Yeah.
the majority always has to join the minority to bring them up.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
That's right.
But in this case, we're the majority, and yet we can't even get together with each other.
Well, and that's why I point out that just like men disidentify with the victim, women disidentify with themselves.
That's the institutionalization that's happened.
That's right.
That causes women to see that as right.
That's right.
Where you said you didn't, I don't understand how she could say that. It's so ingrained in how we do things for eons
That's right.
that
I was hoping it was just
you
the
can't even
older
imagine it.
generation.
Yeah.
I know that's true in the
Yeah.
older generation, but you see it in 18, 19, 20.
Again, I think it boils down to power.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
having power, having the ability to control or manage certain assets, and because I have that power, I want more, so you're going to try to.
But it's not inevitable.
Uh-huh.
I mean, as I say, I know as many men who are completely baffled by this behavior as women, and just think about teachers. If you're a teacher, I saw this from the time I started to teach. These students, you've got power over them, and a lot can go on, a lot can go down. Most teachers would never exploit that. Are really careful to be fair and kind, and yet, one, I don't know what the stats are, but let's say 1 out of 100 is going to use that power. It's too alluring, it's too seductive to have that kind of power over another person, over other kids, over.
My daughter can't walk down the street without cat calls and cars coming
Sure.
up to her and, hey baby,
Yeah.
Is that power? It's almost like a pack mentality, like they just
But look
think
at
it's
how
okay.
look at how that reinforces. That's such an interesting. It's so common
They're
and
not
it's so
trying to,
interesting.
rape her or anything, but it's so uncomfortable, she can't walk.
But isn't it a way of saying we own the streets?
Pretty much, yeah.
You belong to us if you're
Yeah.
on the street. And
So that's where they
I know it's like when that happens, particularly a young woman, you just die of embarrassment and shame because suddenly your body it feels like you're naked. It feels like you're
Calls
exposed.
an Uber to come, she can't finish her walk.
Sure.
It's like,
Sure. So it is power. It's a different, it's a different expression of it, but it is all part of this exact same, keeping the status quo. And every angle, however, wherever a woman moves, it's going to emerge in some manner or another.
And I do think to the idea that this is happening now, I think it's actually happening worse right now
Uh-huh.
than it has because we're starting to come open about it.
That's
We're
right.
Starting to speak up, so there's an
Backlash.
increased insecurity
Yeah,
that's causing it to happen even more to try to press it back down.
right.
We have to keep moving forward and continue to come out and continue to speak to it, not let it get lost in all these other distractions. Oh,
That's
this
right.
is happening here. Let's distract us from this and this. We have to keep persisting, or we're fighting an institution. We're not fighting
That's right.
an individual.
That's right.
And unless we can continue to persist, it's not.
And we have to move on despite the fact that it's sometimes unfair and it's messy and it's not, it's not a perfect.
And we're going to lose before we win. We're going to lose cases. We're going to lose.
Yes,
you
that's
don't
right.
build
And you
that,
just have to
like
keep-
what your attorney told you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is the educational phase of the change. And it requires sacrifice. New York Magazine last week, this last issue, the newest issue of New York Magazine, I don't know why they send it to me, but they do. There were about the little postage stamp photos of about 40 of the women who have Me Too'd, who have come forth, and how their lives have been ruined. Even though these were all cases that ended up, you know, they were vindicated because many other women came forward and so on. They are now dirt on the job market. So it requires a tremendous amount of sacrifice. And honestly, you know, when I look back at my life and see some of the things I lost because of it, I feel lucky to have had the opportunity to do whatever it takes and live in a way that's in harmony with myself.
No, that's really true, and it comes down to economic independence.
Yes.
For women like us who are able to say, we don't buy into this, and we don't believe that anyone has to buy into it. The world will be better for men and women once we change this narrative.
Right.
The only way that we're able to do it is because we're economically independent.
And economically independent is a huge leap that we have to make.
It is
40% of working women work in jobs that do not give them economic independence. So how does that change? More women are graduating college, more women than men. That's a step. But that's in a way the focus, you know.
So in the sciences, you probably know this, biological sciences, I just read a statistic that women outnumber men by something like close to 70% graduate-wise, but they're employed at 20.
Right, right. And that's where, I mean, I've actually written about this elsewhere, but if women don't have power, the things that they need in order to get the great jobs and power are not going to be available to them. So until women have power, you're not going to have subsidized daycare. You're not going to have, I mean, women are still doing all the domestic work, except where there's, you know, a wonderful partner, all of the present company, I'm sure. You know, it's very rare, it's very hard to set it up. I always use this example, Frank's heard it 4,000 times, but my husband was working for a company that had 6 months paternity leave. And so when our daughter was born, I said, hey, you know, 6 months paternity leave, and he looked at me and said, I'd be dead in the water. I can't as a man take that. So even when it's available, it's culturally so frowned on that you can't even do it. So we have to, I mean, what they had to do in Sweden, by the way, is give females 6 months maternity, and then after that, males get to have 6 months paternity, and if they don't take it, it does not go back to her. It's finished. So it forced the men to take it, if you see what I mean. So you need numbers. You need a lot of men doing it so it becomes a new normal. Otherwise, you know, it's women are working part-time, they're working fewer hours, they're working flex time because they're trying to take care of a home and family. Yeah.
So I don't know if what I'm going to say is, for this group, is appropriate or not. First of all, the experiences that you ladies have had, I don't think any of us guys can relate to in any way, or, you know, but I'm Caucasian, in the music business, part of my life, and certainly a different life today. And I do think, just to cut to the chase, that there's been an extraordinary evolution of thinking in terms of speaking out, in terms of the experiences that you're talking about. I'm married, maybe I should say that. I have a sister, I had a mom, and I've always been very cognizant of respect. But all that being said, you know, early in the music business, 73 to 78, Neil Bogart, I don't know if you know that name, but there was a much looser, well, it goes to the evolution. There was a looser feeling about contact, I'll say, hugging people, just as hello, you know, that kind of thing. But the real point I wanted to get to, you know, I think it's really, this is my opinion, obviously, but I think as you make this a political far left, far right, center argument, I think you hurt yourself.
In what way? Say
Well,
a
I've
little
already
more.
heard politics brought up, and maybe rightly so in the sense of action that was taken. But I can tell you from a group that I'm involved in, I have my own brain trust. Most of them are women. They're highly accomplished women. This is a community organization, so it's not a matter of pay or anything like that. But where I'm going is that, and I'm sorry I talk slow to you.
Oh, that's okay.
It's just that the fact that you have the Me Too movement is incredible because it gives everybody a voice, no matter how insignificant, which is significant, or how terrible the circumstance. From the person that's very shy and ordinarily wouldn't speak out, the power of the numbers, and having people that are articulate and can't speak on behalf of the quiet person that would not ordinarily say something. But I think that I can tell you, I didn't vote for Hillary, had no intention to. I didn't vote for Donald, had no intention to. Voted for my local politics. And I'm saying that because I think it's important because all too often is something becomes targeted or characterized in one fashion, you lose a big portion of people that are like-minded. It's just that there's an element of alienation, unfortunately.
Where do you think can you pinpoint that alienation?
Intolerance.
A sense of intolerance.
Absolutely.
So, you know, you say a couple of things that I think are important to address. One is, when I was talking about the...
I almost went to Middlebury College, but now I'm glad I didn't.
Take Hillary Clinton. It's not about whether you would vote for Hillary Clinton or not. It's, you know, it's up to you. It's, does she represent ideas that you believe in? But it's how do we extract from the decision the parts of us that are unwittingly, unconsciously prejudiced against women in power. So this might have nothing to do with you, but now whenever we hear the word she's unelectable, she's not likable, we know those are the buzzwords, the signals, the code that says she's a woman. We can't vote for her.
I think every experience that you're talking about here really applies to the ladies that are here. There's no question of it. I'm just trying to, the issue of pay should be on merit as far as I'm concerned, and therefore should be equal pay for equal work.
Of course.
Right now, it's just an expression. It's not in place, as you pointed out. It just seems to me that you do have the ability of having a larger voice. I think there have been circumstances, and I'm trying to avoid political issue, in regards to where the Me Too movement speaks out and where they don't. And I think if there was a more equal-handed...
Well, can you give an example? Because I think this is very important for us to know, those of us who are activists and who care about...
Well, I'm going to get everybody going here.
That's okay, because that's what we're here for. I want to learn...
Supreme Court Kavanaugh.
What about him?
Yeah.
What was the evidence against him? No, really, you're rolling your eyes, but the main person who is quote-unquote a credible witness...
You didn't believe her?
No, it's not a question of that. It's not a question of me believing her. It's a question that the people that she named to substantiate her story didn't substantiate her story.
We don't know that.
And so as a result, okay, that's
You've
fine.
got, you've got people shaking their heads saying, yeah, that's
Okay,
true.
okay, but.
That's a wonderfully complicated, messy example.
It's a messy example.
Absolutely.
I totally
Absolutely.
agree. And I also recognize emotionally that there's a whole lot more involved with
Yeah.
that particular chair on the Supreme Court. Okay, so I get that.
Yeah.
But it's the idea, and I'm hoping that you'll speak to it, that those people that are guilty and responsible for the invasion of the sanctity of someone's circumstance,
yeah.
whether it's mental, physical,
Yeah.
whatever. Guilty, put them in jail, whatever the proper situation is. But where does the Me Too movement come when there is, let's forget that it's Kavanaugh, where there's an accusation made. Is the act, no, let's not say it's false. Let's just say we don't know. We don't know
Kavanaugh's
if
a great
it's false
example,
or
though.
true.
He
Well,
really
that's
is
my
a great
point.
example.
That's all my point is.
And you're raising a terribly important question, and that's what I was referring to, and I hope other people will talk too. When I said this is going to be messy, it's because it's not a court of law, because it's a haphazard movement. It's not like there's a committee of board members who are making the decisions and decide. It's not like that. But it was. So maybe the only thing about it is that there was allowed this voice to speak, and she was heard and respected. And what people ultimately, how they responded was now public in a way that, I was part of the Anita Hill.
Justice Tone.
Yes, I was there for that, and then we did symposium, a huge symposium afterwards, to look at. We knew she'd lose. She did have credibility. She did, corroborate her story. And yet it made no difference whatsoever. And I think that there's something different that's happened between then and the Kavanaugh. But we don't know how. We're in a very new position now of having to discuss and adjudicate these things that have in the past been just called he said, she said. How do you know? You weren't there. So it's a mess right now because we're learning. So for example, if 10 other women come forward, okay, now we have to listen. If nobody else comes forward, and if her story is not corroborated, her best friend won't testify, maybe this one isn't a good example. You see what I mean? In other words, it's not going to get clearer than that. It's
the fact that we have this institution that for decades there was no mechanism for us
That's
to
right.
report.
That's right.
So we're just now getting to a place where we're trying to report, but because it hasn't happened all this time,
There's
how
no
do you
rules.
prove, how do you show unless 10 other people come
That's
out and
right.
say, he did it to me too, or she did it to me,
That's
whatever,
right.
whatever. But without that, it's very difficult. And we still don't have a great mechanism because there are many, many young women who are getting assaulted in college.
Yeah.
I have data and
Yeah,
information there that are not reporting.
Well, and
So,
part of the reason why they're not reporting is
It's
that,
not there. The structure's
well,
not
and
there.
what happens when you get on the stand is somebody's going to try and rip you apart.
Yeah.
So it is so difficult, and I don't think there's any kind of, it's going to alienate people who, it's inevitable.
Well, what
There's-
you said is very important, and a couple of other people said it too, is that, if you're in a position where you could lose your job, or lose some effort of some stature in your community, whether
Mhm.
it's college or
Mhm.
wherever it might be, your job,
Mhm.
it's intimidation.
It's terrible.
And to feel the physical violation that I just can't imagine it.
We have more protections for whistleblowers than we do for women who've been molested.
And we don't have enough protection for whistleblowers.
Think about.
Really?
I'm sorry, I forgot her name, the one in the Kavanaugh.
Yeah, yeah.
I think of her as a whistleblower, and I believed her. I believed her.
I absolutely believed her, but it doesn't mean
That's fine, but.
that there was
you know,
corroborative.
If you're gonna destroy somebody's reputation and career, I'd like to see some proof. I'm certain that there are people here that want to say
Except
there's
her.
plenty of proof.
Yeah, except
But
he's
to a-
on the Supreme Court, and she
Yeah,
got
and
punished.
her career was ruined.
Exactly.
But are you aware that there was another witness and the FBI did not?
There were several.
There
There
were
were
several.
There were several other people,
Not-
and they
but-
did not allow them to
But-
testify.
But
How
but
is
this-
that my problem though? I'm
But
not
this
sure
was
this
partisan, you're talking about things get too partisan, it was partisan politics that shut down the FBI investigation of dozens of people at Yale who witnessed this behavior, one of whom is a very major
But you
guy
and I
in
can-
Washington.
You and I can agree that any either illegal activity or any intimidation to prohibit
Yeah.
the advancement of looking at investigation in and of itself is wrong, okay?
Oh, right,
I mean,
so-
you and I would agree with that.
But to sit in this room and say that, you know, that there wasn't enough,
Evidence.
evidence against Kavanaugh, when you're not actually going out to seek the actual evidence that does
Yeah, but that's
exist.
not me. It's,
Well-
you've got,
But
excuse
he's
me,
saying that this is what was
excuse me.
presented to the
You
public,
have-
and what do we know?
You have Washington DC, you have
Yeah.
you have, well, you have what is it, committee that has the ability of bringing it forth.
Yeah, but the
Within
committee
a
was
week.
partisan.
Or however long it was.
You know,
Okay.
it's like the Leonard Cohen song,
and he's
the
being
dice are loaded.
He's being given a job for life by
Like
law
Leonard
that is not under the, that job could have been given to a lot of people.
It was a big
Was there another
patriarchal
person
crush.
that could have applied?
I think.
This isn't a criminal burden of proof. This is giving someone a job for life, ruling over our judicial system.
Yeah.
Right, so that, to me, it's not the burden of proof, it's like,
Yeah, but
goodness gracious.
to the American public,
If
and
you were
I
gonna
don't
hire
mean,
me and I had accusations like that, you'd probably turn to another candidate that didn't have
This
that
is
kind of
what-
stuff,
this is
you know,
the
until
point
you
Well,
resolved it,
That
until
I
you
was
resolved
going
it.
to make. I believe,
I
this
agree.
is how I see it. Whatever all that is, how many times have we seen in our own lives an example, and unfortunately I can't think of a perfect one right now, of someone who has controversy about them. They're going for a job and they stand down or are told to stand down because it's inappropriate to give the example that someone with that kind of controversy deserves to have that much power.
Until it's resolved.
That is what is so wrong about Kavanaugh being on that seat, in my mind.
well, he's innocent until proven guilty, no?
No, no, no,
Yeah,
it's
but-
not about
I mean,
that.
are we in America?
It's about the example
I
that we
understand.
gave to our country.
It's not, he's not
But
on
that-
trial.
Oh, he
This
was.
is a job
Are you
interview.
kidding me?
This
He
is
was
a job
absolutely on
interview.
trial.
But it
Let's-
wasn't
let's hear-
resolved,
yeah.
it wasn't given time to be resolved to the burden of proof, and so why give him the job until it
It's
is?
the court of a public opinion.
Well, unfortunately, the court that was trying him was quite
Rigged.
prejudiced, rigged, yeah.
What I've noticed in this evolution is what's happening on the perpetrator side. There's the thought that if it can't be proven, it's not true.
Right.
Which we all know that the acts are predominantly
Yeah.
isolated and
Yeah.
hidden. And all we really have is the repetition and other victims is our only proof.
Right.
And the other thing is the victimizing of the perpetrator because he lost his job,
Yeah.
didn't get a job,
Yeah.
shouldn't have been fired, the Al Franken situation. You know, I love Bill Maher, but his defense of Al Franken, never mentioning the victims of Al Franken and his behavior, only that Al Franken shouldn't have quit his Senate seat, shouldn't have been driven out of the Senate for Al Franken. and this is a side I've noticed.
You know,
That, how Al Franken lost his job. Well, how long are his victims gonna suffer?
you know, you're raising a point that Terry has just kind of raised with me that I had never thought about how we almost, I'll let you say it, but we always have the criminal's last word about what happened, not the victim. And when Terry was just describing the woman in Greece, she was fighting for her life till the last, that we usually don't even have that information. It's simply whatever the criminal was doing and what he, you know, women's voices are suppressed, women's lives are suppressed. And I think that's true, but I think that the extent to which any forum that we have for adjudication is so rigged that if you're a woman, in addition to having been molested at some point or another, for example, when I lost my job at Middlebury College, when they terminated me, there was an internal review made up of 5 men, because they're all men, and about whether I should be terminated because I protested it. And the internal review decided that I should not, that there was no justification for my termination. I was never told that. The president, the internal review could only report to the president of the college. They could not talk to me personally or anybody else. They're sworn to secrecy. They told the president simply lied and told me that they agreed with my termination and I was terminated. And this all came out in the trial, the courtroom trial, the case that I lost, but the president had to step down for having lied. I mean, it's rigged.
Yeah, but my basic point is, because when I went to school, I graduated in '72, I'm an old guy, there was something called in loco parentis. And the school, assuming the parental guidance of management of the students, the evolution from that, what happened to you is terrible.
Well, I'm
But
just
that
saying
was the norm.
the dice is loaded.
That was, the dice was loaded, definitely. So, but the power of having your group, I say your group, I want it to be our group, but it just feels like someone like me, as terrible as I think everything that you've talked about is, and as much as I am absolutely, I want to say for exactly what Me Too is about, there's a side of Me Too that makes me put up my hands and say, hang on a second, there's an element, and certainly there's intolerance other places, but there's this element of intolerance in terms of fair consideration, which everybody here has not gotten. I get that. But there's a lot of people out there who've not had to deal with, unfortunately, what you guys have had to deal with. I'm not expressing it well. I feel
Well, I think you
terrible about
are. I think what you're saying,
but it's the intolerance.
I get it.
It's just in America now, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, and it's also, there's been a tremendous blowback about PC in general and about, you know, and I'm with you on a lot of the extremism. I mean, the idea that in class we can't have a conversation like this because, God forbid, somebody should feel offended or it's too much for them or it triggers them. No, you know, and I feel very alienated from that part of what's going on right now.
And how far back are you going to go?
And how far back are you? And those are really.
I'm with you on that.
That's legit. Those are legitimate questions. Those are important. I guess I became very political when I was about 25, so I've been at it, you know, for a chunk of time. And in our course too, we actually look at every one of the movements and you know, civil rights and Black Panthers and feminism and gay rights. Every one of them went overboard, became excessive, arrogant, you know, fuck you to everybody else. This is the right thing, and every one of them had to deal with backlash and blowback. And it seems to be almost the nature of
You want to
political.
be heard, that's the big thing.
It's partially that, and it's also, if you think of it, like centuries of fury that
Yeah,
just
yeah.
erupts, and every one of the incidents and unfairnesses that have not been addressed, are going to hang on to that, Tom Brokaw or this one, because finally somebody is and it's really politics. Movements are so messy. But I have a lot of fears in the same way you do of who's being alienated, how can we bring them in? Oh.
It's inevitable. There will be victims of false accusations.
Yeah, yeah.
And their defense is the same as our defense. There will probably be a history of false accusations by that person. So that's what they can rely on. But there's
That's
going to
good.
be victims of false accusations.
Yes.
And there are going to be victims
That's
of
right.
actual.
Well, there always has been, I'm so sorry, there already have been people who, I didn't do it type of thing. But the percentage of people who are being falsely accused
Very
is
small.
much smaller compared
Yeah.
to what actually happens
Yeah.
to us as women in a
Yeah.
general forum. Additionally to that, I feel, to your point, we're angry.
Yeah.
This shit has been happening to us for so long, and and we get infuriated. You're gonna have people who are gonna be here. And on the same token, there are decent men out there, and
Oh,
we
of
know
course.
that.
Yeah.
And I feel like we need to also pay attention so that men who are on that side aren't being attacked.
That's
and
right.
We're not like,
That's
all
right.
men are, POS. You know what I'm saying? So that they can acknowledge that it's happening without feeling like, well, I'm a decent guy. I don't do that kind of stuff. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes,
So that we can include the men in the movement, because when we have everyone together working on it, then we can move forward. And yes,
Right.
it's messy, but we need to keep that
Yeah.
clarity that these things are happening.
And I think to understand how we're all part of the same script, different aspects of it, but, men are being, I cannot believe that a man who actually rapes a woman isn't inside himself, something's really wrong, tormented, in pain. You don't do that if you're a decent, happy person. It's just not, it doesn't work that way. So there's something really, triggering these guys who also need understanding.
I'd like to flip the word intolerance that you use, that I know it feels like it's coming at you right now, but I'd like to flip that because when you use the word intolerance, that I understand why when you're in a category of people that tends to do something and you may not be that person, that you feel like it's coming at you. But I think once, if we flip that to, I think the ask right now of people, let's just say anyone who's in a privileged category, let's just say that, is that you just acknowledge the fact that you have that privilege. So I have certain privileges because of my economic status right now. I have certain privileges because I'm a lighter skinned person of color. I have certain privileges for different reasons, right? Just acknowledging that and acknowledging that we are complicated beings with different privileges and recognizing how they layer on top of each other. And I think that's a big ask right now, just of anybody, is to recognize that and to take it away from feeling like we're attacking each other, but more looking at ourselves as complicated beings who have lives. And with those lives, because of the structure we live in, because of this institution we live in, the infrastructure, it comes with privileges. And those privileges, unfortunately, come with costs to those groups that are not privileged. So we just have to acknowledge that. And once we acknowledge it and we accept it, then maybe we can work to reverse some of those and equalize them. But we're just barely getting to the point where people are recognizing that they have privileges, because everybody
That's
wants
right.
to. It's much easier in a conversation like this to be a victim than it is to be the person that understands that my category of people has done wrong to other people. You don't, without, the personal part of that isn't that I was the Nazi or I was this, but I am a member of that group of people who lives with a privilege that other people don't have. And